nothing but the truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you and the one clear truth that emerges. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just concluded a highly successful visit to the US. US President Joe Biden went out of the way to welcome India's Prime Minister, including not only having an official visit, a state dinner, as well as having a private dinner where his wife Jill played hostess to Prime Minister Modi. They even exchanged gifts, and Prime Minister Modi presented the First Lady of the US, Jill Biden, with a lab diamond, quite large, looked like the Kohinoor from the size it was, and also gave President Biden an edited text of the Upanishads. All this showed tremendous amount of atmospherics in terms of style, in terms of the way they welcomed each other, the hugs that they gave. Itself was indicative of the kind of warmth that these two leaders shared. But as important was the fact, the kind of substance and the outcome that this particular visit had, which put India-US relations into a completely new trajectory. It is, let's call it, the next big thing to have happened in Indo-US relations. And I'll get into some of the details, but first, let's look at why is it such a big deal. Let's not forget that Indo-US relations has really been a roller coaster ride across the decades. Most of the time, it has been down rather than up. Take a look back at history, and you'll find that in 1974, when India first exploded a nuclear device, it was the US that brought heavy sanctions against India, and relations were extremely cold. That was a downer because India had to face a lot of criticism and was treated as an outcast. Things improved during the 80s and 90s, but when India tested again in 1998 under Prime Minister Vajpayee, relations again went down to a real nadir. It would take, and I'm really shortcutting history, it would take Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, when he went and visited President George Bush in 2005 for a real breakthrough. And what was that? That was the Indo-US civil nuclear deal, which lifted all. There was a huge, huge boulder that was there between India and US, particularly on the nuclear question, and that had prevented the progress of relations. What President Bush and Dr. Manmohan Singh did was to sign this agreement that lifted all the various sanctions that were there against India, and particularly allowed internationally, in terms of the nuclear suppliers group and others that had prohibited India from either importing nuclear fuel or getting nuclear technology, that was lifted. And America also changed its law. That opened the doors, because the moment that happened, India was allowed to retain its military program or weapons program on the nuclear front, but at the same time it was allowed to import nuclear fuel, which was very important for the power plants that were there, because they were all running at very low capacity, 50% and below, and the fact that they could get other countries to build nuclear reactors for them. Of course, despite this huge breakthrough that happened, we see that in the next decade after that, 2008 is when they concluded the entire Indo-US nuclear deal, but real technological breakthrough in terms of transfer of technology would take a decade to come, despite the fact that President Barack Obama had started what was called the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative in 2012. Then progressive presidents, including President Trump, began the process of trying to lift all the export regulatory regimens that were there, including India signing the foundation agreements, where in terms of trust between USA in sensitive technology began to improve considerably, and that was very critical. That laid the base for what was to happen on June 22nd, when we saw a quantum leap in India-US relations. And let me get into what are the key factors that differentiate it. Of course, as I said earlier, it is the next big thing that happened. It is the nuclear deal that opens the front in terms of technology. And then you see what I call a quantum leap that has happened right now. Take the first big technology that was sold, or the agreement that was there that happened between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, which really was the GE fighter jet engine to be supplied to HAL in a major technology transfer that has never happened in relations, defense purchases between India and the US. What did it do? Why is it such an important thing? Because India had struggled for a long time to build fighter jet engines and didn't succeed. Their experiments with Kaveri, which the DRDO did, the Defense Research and Development Organization had tried to build it, it never really worked. And so jet engine technology, fighter jet engine technology is vastly different from commercial jet engines, which we also don't make. And the difference is that because of the high speeds it has to go, remember that this is on combat. So you're flying at several times the speed of sound, Mach 2, Mach 3. Then you're also decelerating and accelerating. You're also going at high altitude and also very, very cold temperatures and pressure. All that requires very great amount of complexity to build these engines. They're not easy to build, particularly the alloys that go with it, because there could be cracks that could develop as you keep using this with the kind of intensity that you do. So India gaining this transfer of technology is a very critical development in its defense ambitions that's there. Now, of course, we need to look at the fine print of that deal. From what we understand is that the Americans would be transferring, GE would be transferring around 80% of the technology. Now, that's substantial. Earlier we were negotiating for about 50 to 60%. Now it has gone to 80%. We need to know what that other 20% is about, whether it's on the alloys front or in terms of engine parts. But it is a big beginning, and I think that's very critical and also shows the kind of trust that has developed between the two countries, because this highly sensitive technology, which is not, barring the close allies, America does not sell it or transfer it to anybody. So transfer of technology is the big name that has happened. The second very interesting thing that has happened, which is really on the technology front and on the space, space relations that we have in our space program, there's been a huge development after the Biden-Modi meeting, and this is with regard to the fact major collaborations were announced. The first is the Artemis project, and the Artemis project is essentially spearheaded by the United States, and the idea is to put, or actually return the US to the moon. US human flights had stopped in 1972, and they'd never gone back to the moon after that in terms of the fact that they landed, and they've never done that since 1972. Now what has happened is that under the Artemis project, they want to get back to the moon by 2025, and there has been an agreement signed between Indian Space Research Organization, which is ISRO, and NASA, which is the National Aeronautic and Space Administration of the US, the counterpart that we have. And there is an agreement now to do a joint mission that is in terms of the Artemis. We are part of the accord that is there. The other thing is the fact, another joint mission that which has been signed is India and the US to go into the International Space Station that has been hovering around for 20 years. We have never been on that. Now, why is this so significant? Because India is on the verge of conducting its first human space flight on its own, called the Gaganyaan project. It has experienced some delays, and when I spoke to the ISRO chairman, there were issues in terms of understanding astronaut behavior, as well as the environment that is there in the capsule that takes the astronauts into space, and they have to live in it. Now, some of these technologies can be ironed out by the kind of collaboration that is there. It will give us far greater experience and allow us to get into what is called cutting-edge technology. As we know, China is in a race to get to the moon, and China is planning to put its own human into the moon, its own astronaut over there. They call it taikonauts, if I'm not mistaken, by 2030. So there is a race, and India is now an integral part of that huge race that is there, and that's a big bonus. The other area, and mind you, this is all critical technology that America is giving. They have not done this before. The other issue is in terms of semiconductors. Now, again, this is a cutting-edge area, and as we experienced in COVID, when there was a breakdown in China in terms of the kind of the shutdowns that happen, China is one of the major exporters of semiconductors, and the shortage we all felt, because one of the good examples of consumer shortage is the fact that you couldn't buy a car because a lot of these cars had semiconductor chips built into them. And since there was a short supply, there was a huge waiting list. So when we realized that semiconductors was a very, very critical element, India had started off on its own semiconductor mission. Now the US has joined with India on this thing, in this particular visit, where Micron Industries, a US company which is one of the largest semiconductor manufacturers in the world, is going to invest close to $875 million into India, along with a collaborative project with the government of India and Gujarat to set up a semiconductor plant in Gujarat, which will be the first big project that is there. Of course, you still have to have a huge ecosystem for semiconductors, but it is a good beginning. And the fact that America has allowed Micron to set up. Now, why is that important? Because America had decided that after COVID, it would set up a lot of its plants in its own soil. It earlier used to allow what is called offshoring, but when it realized that there was a problem, it brought a lot of these manufacturers into America and gave it incentives to make in America itself. So making India an exception to put one of the plants there is a big, big development. Now, there are other technologies that this handshake that has happened between the two, or the hug that we saw that was evident, were in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of quantum computing, in terms of Open RAN, which is the kind of latest thing in telecommunication, which matches 6G. We are on 5G at the moment. And all these critical technologies have been delivered in record speed. As I told you earlier, the fact was that America had actually hesitated. They had hesitations about India transferring technology. That has gone in the last, just in 1 year's time, when they set up what was called the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies, ICET, which they signed in May 2022. And barely a year later, most of those technologies figure in the agreement, and that is why it is so critical. They put it on the fast track. There was an urgency that was there, and let us discuss why did America, which had really taken its time to get to India in terms of technology transfers. They were always friends. Things had sort of improved considerably. The past decade was good, but there were ups and downs, more ups than downs, of course. But why, and let's answer that question. Why did America decide in such a rush that India needs to be part of its strategic partnership and part of its worldview that it believes should head to the future, or to this century itself, as both Prime Minister Modi and President Biden talked about? So why is America so aggressively wooing India at this juncture? What are the various triggers that pushed it? Let's begin with the first reason, which is, and there might be 3 or 4 major reasons, I'm just outlining them, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What it did was, apart from kicking up fuel and food prices and pitting the world against each other, splitting the world for an American front and the Russian front, which China in some senses backed Russia, and America began to build its allies in Europe and others and supported Ukraine in its battle against Russia to protect its territory. India took a neutral stand, and this actually, in many senses, disappointed and dismayed America, because they were keen that India would come down heavily on Russia. But India was clear that there was high stakes. Its national interest lay with Russia, because firstly, Russia supplies, in terms of armed forces equipment, Russia supplies almost 60%, or 60% of our equipment that is in armed forces is of Russian origin. It was very critical, and they gave us high technology in the past and continue to do so. And that was very important to maintain the relations, because there was another factor that was happening, as we know, that in May 2020, the Chinese aggression began up in Galwan and in the line of actual control, and there was tensions on the border, and it was critical for India to keep its options open. The other aspect was the fact that the moment fuel prices began to go up, there was a shortage of oil all across, and Russia was willing to sell India oil cheaply. So India kept its national interests in mind and ensured that it had its relations with Russia, despite America gnashing its teeth in, in frustration, that it would maintain good relations with Russia. But in the last couple of months, Prime Minister Modi has made it clear that he does not approve of war, and he believes that dialogue and diplomacy is the way. That was a direct message to Russia in terms of ensuring that there is a speedy end to the war. But this was one of the factors. If you look at what when US saw that India was keeping a neutral stand, it analyzed the situation and found one of the reasons is the heavy dependence that India has in terms of arms equipment to Russia? Could it in some way begin to diminish that dependence and therefore the opening up of tech transfer, particularly in the defense sector? What it believes is that over a period of time, India would begin to rely on the US rather than on Russia. And of course, this suits India because what it does is it allows it bargaining power because it has Russia on one side, it has France on the side, and US on the other side. So no one can really blackmail India into it. You could get the best price that is there. So in some senses, America's emphasis and the speed with which it is doing is to try and somewhat de-link India with Russia in a manner that over a gradual period, it knows India will not shift that rapidly. The second big reason, of course, is the way China has turned aggressive under the current leader Xi Jinping and the big moves it has made, whether it is in the Belt and Road Initiative, to expand its sphere of influence, not only in Europe and Asia, right up to Africa, by setting up infrastructure projects, funding them, and also capturing a lot of the energy supplies that are there. It also became a major threat to the US. It is challenging US as currently US is the sole superpower, but China has great aspiration and believes it is knocking on the door of superpowerdom. And you could see that in the way they have been going about aggressively on the Taiwan front, and we have experienced that in India when they made serious aggressions on the line of actual control in May 2020 in the midst of COVID. Now, what America is doing, it believes that China is now trying to displace displace America from its sphere of influence and become a superpower on its own and challenge America. All these meant that America saw China as the biggest threat going forward. And India, it reasoned, was very important in its plan to create a bulwark against China, to create a balance of power. And the fact that India was also knocking on great power status meant that if they could support India, it would make the difference and build India up in terms of technology, in terms of defense, to pose a challenge to China. Now, India is very clear that while all this is great, it is not going to join an American front, and therefore there could be some disappointment on that front, that they're not going to be a NATO partner or a North Atlantic Treaty Organization partner or NATO plus, that they would chalk out an independent foreign policy. And at the moment, America is agreeable with that, despite all the setbacks. That's the remarkable thing about this particular movement that has happened in India US relations. There are challenges that are there. There are issues of human rights. There are issues of India's approach to Russia, the fact that also India doesn't want to ally directly with USA. These are things that have bothered the relations. But despite that, the fact that America has gone forward is for this very strategic reason that they believe that India in many senses is a pivot to Asian power, apart from Japan and South Korea, that they need to pivot towards India in a big, big way. And therefore, you've seen that. The third aspect of this whole issue and why the triggers move faster is the fact that after COVID or during COVID, we realized how the world, firstly, the global order had changed rapidly, and so did globalization. We became much more insular, and we realized, and America particularly realized, that its dependency on China was enormous. And they, in many senses, couldn't de-link from them completely, couldn't break off, so they started de-risking. And in that, they created what is called an alternate supply chain for all these critical components that I had mentioned earlier, which meant that India could play a major role, and what they now believe is called friendshoring, which is, apart from offshoring, which they don't want, if they could locate factories in friendly countries, China could not threaten them. Their dependency on China would be less, and India is identified as one of that. So it's a great opportunity for India, and the beginning has been made in terms of semiconductors, which we've seen the Micron factory coming up over here. And that's the reason that one of the things that the propelling factors, as we would call it, the driving force of this, the current huge sort of embrace that we have with the US is as a result of that. So there are many more such factors. I'm keeping it to three. A fourth factor would be, and that is as important as the others, is the fact that US views India as one of the biggest economies of the future. We're already the fifth largest. We'll soon be the third largest. And that means that there could be tremendous amount of trade. They're looking at Indian markets. We are a great consumer country. And what are the kind of goods and services that India could not only import from the US, but also export to the US. And this is something that they are keen on working on, because so far India-US trade relations has been not up to expectations. Though we have seen a great improvement in the last 5 years, it has moved right now to close to $200 billion. It was hovering around $120 to $140 billion in the last 6-7 years. That's gone up. But they had hoped that by this time, Indo-US trade would be $500 billion. It is still not even half that potential. In the meanwhile, China has almost $750 billion trade with USA. That's the comparison, and that's where America believes that there's potential for growth. And for India, it also helps because much of our investments, particularly software and others, is directly linked with the US. And this could be a relationship, an aspect of the relationship that needs a lot more development and growth. We have seen in the past that India and USA have clashed on trade. We have wanted an early harvest deal with them. We have never been able to do that in the last 5-6 years, nor with a free trade agreement or any of these things. That needs to be ironed out because we've had issues with tariffs, with America withdrawing various facilities like the GSP, which gave preferential treatment to Indian exporters. And this has been a rub in the last couple of years. Fortunately, during the Biden-Modi meet, they were able to sort out some of the issues that India had gone to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. 6 of the 7 issues have been reportedly sorted out. There's one more pending. Maybe that will improve relations between the two. So all in all, if you look at what has happened between India and US, this is a tremendously positive development, something that the Prime Minister Modi, as well as the Ministry of External Affairs, should be lauded for, because it was a tricky situation. It's quite remarkable that in the sense, the fact that we have so many other issues with the US, whether, as we've seen, human rights, treatment of minorities, which some of the congressmen has raised, and former President Barack Obama also talked about it, and the fact that the way we approach Russia is not towards the US liking, the way, and the fact that we don't want to get into an alliance with the US must be irking to them. Despite all that, and we have been able to strike a really good deal with that, and we are in a sweet spot. What India wanted was to be multi-aligned, which means that unlike in the past we were non-aligned, this time we believe that we must have a circle of people that we can align towards a multipolar world rather than a unipolar or a bipolar world. That is India's goal, and therefore it is not maintaining equidistance. There has certainly been a big movement towards the US, and correctly so. We are in some senses the right side of history in the way both Russia and China have behaved. But we also need Russia and we need China. And we need to deal with them. So we are keeping those options open, and we are seeing how the Indo-US promise that has been created and also action. I mean, President Biden has really walked the talk on India relations, how that would develop. Now let me just look at a few of the caveats that are there. And why am I saying this? It's good to always try and understand that sometimes these are not linear developments. There are ups and downs, as I mentioned earlier, and we have seen how US-China relations have yo-yoed. At times, they have seen big highs. During the Nixon period, we saw the great rapprochement that happened. And over a period of time, China has gained because of the kind of friendship it has had with the US, and then only in the last decade has begun to have real problems with it. We don't know whether those things will again sort out between China and the US, and we will be left high and dry trying to negotiate through the minefield that is there. So that is one of the cautions that we need to look at, that there could be changing relations, and we need to hedge our bets on that front. The second aspect that we need to think about is that while this is a good deal that is there, we need to be concerned about how we handle China. The fact is that we are the only country that has a border, hot border between China, something like 3,500 kilometers long, and this is a land border that we need to worry about. There is Japan, of course, has a border, South Korea has a border, but they are allied with the US, and they have the kind of backing that US would give them. Some other smaller countries like Vietnam and others would, of course, fear China, but we have to deal with China. Now, this deal allows us a certain leverage in terms of technology, but we cannot be seen to be siding fully with the US at this particular point of view, because we cannot be part of that American front. We cannot, if tomorrow, for instance, China invades Taiwan, would we side US and start a war with China? We have to be concerned about our own issues that are there and protect our border. So that is one of the issues that we need to keep in mind very strongly. And the other issue, I believe, is let us not club Russia and China together. We now, just because Russia is very close to China doesn't mean that they don't want independent relations with India, and their entire reaction to India would be based on what China believes. Russia has its own foreign policy, and it is important that we keep those links open with Russia and not just club them as part of the China group, and our overall strategy of being a multi-aligned and a multipolar world that we are seeking. But just to conclude, this is certainly a very good deal. What has happened between India and US is a positive, a big positive step forward. There are lots of pluses, and this is something we should carry forward in the months to go. We need to look closer at the fine print, especially when it comes to technology transfer. But I think the trust has been built between the two countries. It is for the leaders of these countries and the people to sustain that in the future. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.